She spit on my wife. The saliva hit the concrete between them and spread in a small, ugly circle. The demand that followed didn't stand. The order to remove the tree failed before it even reached the board's inbox. The woman who issued it also ran the neighborhood association. The same authority, the same signature, the same jurisdiction that touched every part of our daily life. The incident became something different once the system behind it was exposed. It became a question of power, not landscaping, a question of who controlled the rules and what happened when those rules met resistance. It became a case study in escalation, assumptions, boundaries, the quiet pressure that builds when authority is left unchecked. Stories like this aren't about trees, they're about structures. They're about what people do when they believe they're untouchable, and what collapses when scrutiny finally arrives. This was only the first fracture. Marjorie Kellman, vice president of our HOA board, shoved the violation notice so hard into my chest, it crinkled against my shirt. "Remove the tree by tomorrow," she said, leaning forward like she owned the ground under my feet. "Or the fines start, and they won't stop." I stood on the community trailside walkway with her shadow cutting through the dirt like a clean strike. My wife was only 3 steps behind me, holding her stomach with one hand and the watering can with the other. And Marjorie didn't even look at her, not until she spit. The glob hit the concrete and spread. That was her line, the line she crossed without hesitation, without shame. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't step toward her. I just looked at the notice she'd crushed against me and said the one sentence she didn't expect. "You cited the wrong section. That species is approved in the HOA manual." She blinked, just once. The kind of blink people do when something shifts under them, something they didn't plan for. It wasn't a victory, not yet, but it was a crack. "I'm Evan," I said finally, because she never bothered learning my name. "Environmental compliance engineer. I helped write the runoff audit that your contractor still uses. So, when I tell you this tree is within regulation, it's within regulation." Her eyes narrowed in that controlled, calculating way I'd already seen during board announcements. That was her power posture, hands behind her clipboard, shoulders stiff, chin tilted. A look that said she was used to people folding, not today. I felt Laura step closer behind me. I could hear her breathing shift, small, tight, scared. Not for the fines, not even for the spit, but because that tree was the first hope we'd had after years of bad news, bad charts, and bad mornings sitting in clinics where no one said what we needed to hear. We planted it the day the test finally showed what we'd been praying for. The rainbow sapling wasn't decoration. It wasn't rebellion. It was a marker of the future we'd almost lost. I felt the weight of that meaning settle across my shoulders, the way I felt Colorado's early cold settling on my skin. Marjorie didn't care. She glanced at the tree like it offended her existence. She muttered something about neighborhood standards and breeders lowering values. She didn't notice the 2 neighbors watching from the sidewalk. She didn't notice Daniel Pierce standing behind his landscaping truck, frozen in place, eyes locked on the spit she'd left drying on the concrete. I saw all of it, and I knew exactly what it meant. Power moves weren't made in board meetings. They were made here, in small corners of public paths, with a clipboard and a rule book, and a belief that no one would push back. "You know," I said quietly, "people are watching. Not a threat, just a fact. A simple observation placed gently on the table between us." She didn't look. That was how I knew she heard it. She stepped back, adjusted her badge, and tried to reclaim her authority with a hard, rehearsed stare. "This isn't over," she said. But the way she said it, she didn't sound certain. I turned to Laura, brushed the back of my knuckles against her arm, and tried to steady her breathing with mine. The sunlight hit the rainbow sapling behind her, catching the tips of its early leaves. I felt the weight of everything we stood to lose, and everything we weren't going to let her take. I faced Marjorie again. "Where are you watching from?" I asked the air, my viewers, my witnesses, the people who would follow this. Because someone needed to. Someone needed to see what authority looked like right before it started to crack. And I felt it, deep in my chest. This was the moment the collapse began. I didn't move at first. Not until Marjorie's footsteps faded down the trail and the clipboard tapping disappeared behind the bend. Only then did I exhale, slow and steady, like the cold morning had been sitting in my lungs the whole time. Laura shifted beside me, her hand still resting on her stomach, and I could feel how hard she was trying to hold herself together. "Let's get off the path," I murmured, guiding her toward the neighbor's front porch just a dozen yards away. The porch belonged to the Carters, the couple who kept wind chimes shaped like tiny blue jays. They weren't home, but their porch swing offered shade and space to breathe. The wood creaked under my weight as I sat, and the breeze carried the faint metallic song of the chimes. Laura took the seat beside me and curled her fingers around the edge of the swing. She didn't cry, she didn't shout. She simply watched the trail where Marjorie had disappeared. Her silence hit harder than anything else. I reached out and ran my hand gently down her arm, hoping she could feel the steadiness I didn't quite feel myself. The community walkway had felt hostile. This porch felt like neutral ground. "I'm fine," she whispered, though her voice carried a tremor. "She's not going to get away with that." She meant it. I knew she did. But I could also see the fear sitting just behind her eyes. Not fear of fines or paperwork or the confrontation itself. It was deeper, more personal. The kind of fear that comes from someone attacking the small, fragile hope you've built after years of disappointment. "Everyone saw it," I said quietly. People were watching. As soon as I said it, the swing stilled. The trail was empty, but the truth lingered. 2 neighbors had frozen mid-step. Daniel had stood behind his truck, jaw locked. There were witnesses, even if none of them had spoken a word. Public exposure wasn't built overnight. It was built in moments like that one, the moment authority revealed itself, unfiltered and unguarded, and people noticed. The porch stairs creaked suddenly, and an elderly man walking his dog paused to glance up, at us. His gaze flicked between me, Laura, and the direction Marjorie had stormed off. "She's getting worse," he muttered under his breath. He didn't stop long enough for conversation. Didn't want to be seen saying anything. Didn't want trouble. But the remark was enough. It slid into place like another puzzle piece. This wasn't an isolated incident. This was a pattern. And now that pattern had touched my wife. I sat back, letting the swing shift beneath us. The wood was warm against my palms. The dog's footsteps faded down the sidewalk until all I could hear were the chimes again. Something about their rhythm steadied my mind. The neighborhood had a pulse, and I could feel it shifting. "She doesn't even care," Laura whispered. "She didn't even look at me." "She will," I said, and I meant it. Because moments like this never stayed hidden. Not when people were watching. Not when fear turned into frustration. Not when power overstepped so boldly that even quiet neighbors froze in disbelief. The seed of exposure had been planted the second Marjorie spit. Not because of the act alone, but because she committed it in public, on community property, during an HOA inspection while wearing her badge. Authority loves obscurity. It hates witnesses. I leaned forward on the swing, elbows on my knees, eyes scanning the street. Copper Ridge wasn't big, but it was close-knit. Houses lined the curved road in a familiar pattern. Stone fronts, slate roofs, native plants in uniform beds, perfect symmetry, forced symmetry. And beneath that veneer, a pressure I had sensed for months but never named. Marjorie controlled too much. The board backed her too easily. People whispered instead of speaking out loud. And now, they'd seen her target a pregnant woman. "This porch is safer," Laura said softly. "Feels like someone else's space, not hers." She was right. Neutral ground mattered. Spaces outside the HOA's immediate chokehold mattered. And in a strange way, sitting here clarified what came next. We weren't just dealing with a petty rule enforcer. We were dealing with someone who believed her jurisdiction extended into places it didn't belong. People's bodies, people's families, people's futures. That kind of authority didn't stop on its own. It needed pressure. It needed light. It needed witnesses willing to step from silence to truth. The porch swing shifted as I stood. The decision felt simple, clean, like something that had already been made long before this morning. The breeze lifted the chimes again, their song sharper now, more urgent. "Let's go home," I said. "I need to start documenting everything." Not for a complaint, not for a private appeal, for something bigger, something that didn't rely on her board or her allies. Public exposure begins with clarity, and I finally had mine. I offered Laura my hand, and as she rose, the sunlight caught the reflection of the rainbow sapling in the distance, A reminder of what we were protecting, a reminder of why this wasn't the end of anything, only the next step in holding authority to its limits. We walked back toward our house, the sunlight stretching across the pavement in thin, sharp lines. Laura stayed close beside me, one hand still cupped under her belly, as though shielding our child from the weight of the morning. The porch we'd just left creaked behind us, fading into the quiet hum of the neighborhood. I kept thinking about the chimes, steady, fragile, insistent. A reminder that even small sounds could carry. I'd barely reached our driveway when I saw movement near the community storage shed at the end of the street. The metal door was half open, and a familiar figure stepped out from the shadowed interior. Daniel Pierce. His uniform shirt wrinkled from the morning rounds. The landscaping company logo slightly faded on the pocket. He froze the second he noticed us approaching. I stopped walking. He didn't look ready to talk, but he also didn't turn away. That alone told me something was shifting. Daniel's truck idled beside him, the tailgate still down. A rake lay across it, forgotten. His posture was tight, shoulders pulled forward, weight on his heels instead of firm on the ground. He kept rubbing his palm against his thigh like he was trying to wipe something off that wasn't actually there. His eyes flicked from me to Laura, then back to the sidewalk, avoiding the place where Marjorie's spit had hit earlier. Guilt was heavy in the air, heavy enough that I could feel it between us. "You all right?" I asked quietly, not stepping closer yet. I didn't want him to feel trapped. He already looked like a cornered animal, tense, alert, ready to flee at the slightest push. His jaw tightened. When he finally looked up, the muscles in his face shifted as if he'd rehearsed every possible reaction, and none of them felt safe. He opened his mouth, closed it, swallowed, hard. His breathing was shallow, chest rising too fast for the calm morning around us. He wasn't just shaken. He was afraid. The internal war showed in everything he did. The way he kept adjusting the strap of his tool belt even though it wasn't slipping. The way his boots scuffed the gravel without purpose. The way he couldn't stand still for more than a few seconds. His eyes held the truth long before he said a single word. He'd seen everything, and he knew it mattered. Laura shifted slightly behind me, and Daniel's gaze flicked toward her. His shoulders caved a little at the sight of her hand on her stomach. A quiet, involuntary step backward followed. A retreat born not of disgust, but of shame. As if he believed he'd already failed her by standing silent when she needed someone to speak. "You don't have to say anything," I told him. "I get it. This isn't easy." His throat bobbed again, harder this time. "I saw it," he whispered, voice barely audible. The words felt torn out of him, like they'd been sitting behind his ribs for too long. I saw everything." He immediately looked away, back toward the shed. His fingers tugged at the hem of his shirt. His feet shifted again, one heel lifting off the ground in nervous rhythm. That rhythm, fast, uneven, said more than anything. He wanted to help. He didn't know if he could survive helping. "Daniel," I said, keeping my tone steady. "She shouldn't have done that. To anyone, but especially not to her." His shoulders spasmed slightly like he'd been struck by the truth of it. He braced one hand against the truck bed, grounding himself, but his posture still faltered. I watched him attempt composure. It slipped right through him. He wasn't conflicted because he doubted what he saw. He was conflicted because he feared the consequences of admitting it. That fear was justified. Marjorie controlled his contracts, his monthly invoices, his renewal agreements. One word from her, and his entire year's income could disappear. He crossed his arms, uncrossed them, then stuffed his hands into his pockets. His knee bounced uncontrollably. He looked at me like he knew the truth, but wished he didn't. "We both know she crossed a line," I said gently. His breathing hitched. A quiet, barely there nod followed. There it was, the crack in his silence. He wasn't ready to speak fully, not yet, but his body was doing it for him. The way his shoulders curved inward every time he glanced at Laura. The way his eyes darted around, checking for Marjorie even though she was nowhere in sight. The way he gripped the edge of the truck so hard that his knuckles turned pale. A man tearing between conscience and survival. "Take care of your wife," he muttered, voice low, throat tight. She didn't deserve that." He turned quickly as if the words might cost him something, and maybe they would, but he said them anyway. He lifted. the tailgate, shoved the rake into the bed, and climbed into the driver's seat with hurried movements. His engine started in a rough sputter, matching the frantic energy that consumed him from the moment we locked eyes. Before pulling off, he paused, only for a heartbeat, and met my gaze through the open window. His expression trembled under the weight of everything he hadn't said yet. Then he drove away. I watched the truck disappear around the curve. The wind picked up, rustling the trees. Laura slipped her hand into mine, holding tight. Daniel was cracking. And that meant the board's protection was too. Witnesses make all the difference, especially when they're fighting themselves harder than anyone else is. And now, that first fracture was widening. Daniel's truck disappeared around the bend, leaving behind the fading echo of its engine and the quiet shift of morning air settling back into the neighborhood. Laura squeezed my hand once more before letting go, and I felt the weight of what had just happened settle somewhere deep in my chest. A witness was cracking. That mattered more than anything Marjorie had thrown at us so far. But the moment didn't hold. My phone buzzed sharply in my pocket, a vibration that felt too insistent, too purposeful. I checked the screen. Another message from the HOA portal. Another violation, another fine. Already, Laura breathed, her brows tightening. I didn't answer. I simply showed her the screen. Failure to comply. Daily penalty applied. The timestamp hit me harder than the words. She sent it 2 minutes after walking away. 2 minutes. She hadn't even reached the end of the path before escalating. The pressure behind my ribs sharpened, but I kept my voice steady. "Let's go," I said. "I'm not dealing with this from our driveway." Copper Ridge's HOA office sat across the community green, a manicured oval of grass surrounded by native shrubs and a stone walkway that curved around a decorative fountain. I'd always thought the fountain tried too hard, too clean, too symmetrical, too controlled. Perfect symbol, I thought as we crossed the green. Authority disguised as aesthetics. The sky stretched wide over us, sharp blue between the clouds. My steps echoed on the stone, each one grounding me as we approached the low glass-front building, where every resident complaint disappeared into silence. The office wasn't large, just a reception area, 2 private rooms, and the board's conference table. But everything about it radiated the same thing Marjorie did. Control through procedure. Inside, the air smelled faintly of lemon polish and static printer heat. The receptionist, a young woman with a headset and a stack of folders beside her, looked up the second we entered. She stiffened slightly as if bracing for something she'd already predicted. "You received the newest notice?" she asked, already glancing at her monitor. "You mean the one issued while we were still standing in front of her?" I said. Her jaw tightened, not defensively, but sympathetically. She lowered her voice. She filed 3 more, backdated. My pulse thudded once, low and heavy. 3, she nodded. Violations for non-compliant vegetation, obstruction of walkway, and failure to maintain uniform aesthetic. She hesitated, her fingers hovering over the keyboard. She flagged them high priority. Laura shifted beside me, and even without looking directly at her, I felt her grip the strap of her bag a little harder. "Can you print them?" I asked. "I shouldn't," the receptionist whispered. "But you should have them." A small rebellion. Not much, but enough to show me the cracks spreading wider. She slid the papers across the counter slowly, almost apologetically. Each page carried the same signature, the same timestamp fraud, the same insistence that we were out of compliance despite the manual proving otherwise. And at the bottom of each form, the threat of lien. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't have to. "This is retaliation," I said quietly. The receptionist's eyes flicked up to mine, fast, sharp, and full of worry. She glanced toward the hallway where the boardroom sat, its heavy frosted glass door pulled shut. "You didn't hear this from me," she murmured, "but she told the board you challenged her authority in public. They're backing her. Again." Laura inhaled sharply, a tiny sound that sliced right through the polished quiet of the room. Authority wasn't just consolidated here. It was being abused in real time. And if retaliation escalated this quickly, the pattern wasn't new. It was practiced. "Thank you," I told the receptionist, meaning it. As we stepped back outside, the breeze hit us again, carrying the faint scent of pine needles from the trees lining the green. The fountain burbled steadily behind us, its rhythmic trickle sounding almost smug in its consistency. Laura walked a few steps ahead, running her hand along her belly again, protective, thoughtful, hurt. When she turned back toward me, the sun caught her face, highlighting the raw mix of fear and stubborn resolve tightening her expression. "She's not stopping," she said. "Not until she gets what she wants." "She's overreaching," I replied. "An overreach leaves a trail." I looked around the green, at the homes facing the office, at the windows where curtains moved slightly as residents watched without stepping outside. They saw the patterns. They understood them. But patterns only mattered when someone forced them into the light. Public exposure didn't begin with news crews or microphones. It began with evidence. It began with witnesses. It began with retaliation too bold to hide. "We're leaving," I told Laura. "I need to get home. I'm documenting every second of this." As we crossed the green again, the fountain's spray catching in the sunlight, the inevitability of what was coming settled deep into me. Authority had pushed too far, and now the limits were going to push back. We crossed the green in silence, the weight of those backdated violations pressing heavier with each step. By the time we reached our driveway, the wind had picked up just enough to rustle the branches of the rainbow sapling, its young leaves trembling like they sensed the tension settling over the house. Laura paused beside it, her fingertips brushing one of the small branches as though apologizing for the chaos swirling around it. "I'll be inside," she murmured. "Just don't stay out too long." "I won't," I said, though the truth was already forming in my mind. I wasn't going inside, not yet, because something wasn't sitting right. Not just the retaliation, not just the fines. Something deeper, something older, something I'd noticed long before Marjorie spit on my wife. Stormwater patterns. They'd bothered me for months. Small things at first. Standing water where it shouldn't be. A subtle shift in the soil line behind the trail. Runoff pooling near the playground during last month's heavy rain. Forming rivulets that cut through the mulch like tiny fault lines. Most people would have ignored it, blamed weather or irrigation. But I wasn't most people. Environmental compliance wasn't just my job, it was instinct, pattern recognition, cause and effect. And right now, everything in me said the HOA had done something they weren't allowed to do. "I'll be back in a few minutes," I told Laura softly. She nodded, trusting me in that quiet, steady way she always had, then walked toward the front door while I headed the opposite direction. Around the house, past the trail, and toward the community playground at the edge of Copper Ridge. The air shifted as I moved downhill. The neighborhood sounds, distant chatter, the hum of a lawn, trimmer, the faint clatter of a delivery truck, faded behind me. Ahead, the playground sat empty, its swings swaying gently though no one touched them. It was peaceful when children weren't using it, almost too peaceful. But I wasn't here for peace. I walked past the shade canopy, past the mulch bed, straight to the drainage easement behind the swings. A narrow strip of land cut into the hillside, reinforced with stone in some places and lined with native grasses in others. The kind of feature most residents forgot existed. I crouched near the edge, fingers sliding into the soil. Damp. Firmer than it should be. Heavier. The kind of compaction you get when water isn't flowing the way the original grading intended. And then, the giveaway. A shallow trench carved into the earth. Not natural, not random, not accidental. The cut was too clean, too consistent. Someone had redirected runoff. I followed the line of the trench with my eyes, tracing it back toward the fence line, behind the newer homes. Homes approved under the revised landscaping plan implemented last year. Homes Marjorie personally oversaw. I felt my pulse pick up, not from panic, but from clarity. This was deliberate. Someone had rerouted drainage through an unapproved path to protect the new builds, and they'd pushed the overflow straight toward the playground and the creek bed farther down the slope. Illegal, unpermitted, unsafe, and every single violation linked back to one person's jurisdiction, Marjorie's. I stood slowly, brushing soil off my hands, then walked farther along the easement until I reached the section where the grass thinned, revealing exposed roots and warped stone edging. The kind of warping that happened when water pressure built behind a barrier not designed to hold it. This could cause erosion, I whispered to myself, and a collapse. Not speculation. Fact. The system here wasn't built for high-volume redirection, and with spring storms coming, The risk wasn't small. It was imminent. A low rumble rolled over the hill. Not thunder, but Daniel's landscaping truck. He wasn't close, but I could hear the engine passing the upper street. The sound tugged my memory back to earlier. His fear, his guilt, the way his shoulders buckled when he looked at Laura. He knew something. Maybe not everything, but enough. I crouched again, tracing the ridge where the trench met the old drainage swale. The soil here was even more compacted, mixed with fine gravel, the kind landscapers used for temporary rerouting during construction, not for permanent alteration. I exhaled slowly, the truth settling into me with cold precision. This wasn't a mistake. It was a cover-up. And once exposed, it wouldn't just undermine Marjorie's authority. It would dismantle it. I took out my phone, snapping photos from multiple angles. The unnatural trench, the shifted soil, the warped stone. I captured the way the path diverged from the original grading pattern. Every image felt like another step towards something larger, something I could already feel building beneath the surface of this quiet neighborhood. This was the leverage I needed, not for revenge, not for retaliation, for truth. Public exposure begins with something undeniable, something that can't be rewritten with a violation notice or buried in an HOA meeting agenda. I stood, dusting my hands again, and looked back toward the playground. Sunlight glinted off the slide, clean and bright, oblivious to the danger sitting just behind it. A danger created by the same woman who'd tried to bully my wife. She wanted power. She'd taken too much of it, and power taken beyond its limits always collapsed under scrutiny. I turned toward home, my steps steady, my mind sharper than it had been all morning. I finally had the first piece of something she couldn't control, and I wasn't stopping here. By the time I reached our street again, the sun had shifted, high enough to cast sharp, clean shadows across every driveway. The neighborhood looked quiet, almost peaceful, but that playground soil still sat under my fingernails, cold and undeniable. I'd walked away with proof, not suspicion, not theory, but evidence of something the HOA had no legal right to modify. It should have steadied me. It didn't. Because the second I turned toward our house, I saw Laura sitting on the front steps, elbows resting on her knees, her head bowed. Not crying, just still. Too still. The kind of stillness that came when someone was trying very hard not to break. I walked toward her, my footsteps crunching over the gravel edging. She lifted her head at the sound, and the look in her eyes forced every other thought out of my mind. She sent another notice, she said quietly. This time, she claims our tree is causing visual disruption to the neighboring property line. I exhaled slowly. It's not even near the property line. She doesn't care, Laura whispered. She's going after anything she can. Her voice shook, and she pressed her hand against her stomach again. That instinct, protective, involuntary, hit me like a punch. The world sharpened around us. The air felt thinner. Even the sound of a distant lawnmower grated across my nerves. I sat beside her, letting the concrete warmth ease into my palms. We're not letting her push us into fear, I said. Not today. Not after everything we've survived to get here. Laura leaned into me slowly, resting her head against my shoulder. I could feel her breath stutter, then even out. She wasn't fragile, not by any measure. She'd walked through years of disappointment and testing, and doctors' offices that smelled like disinfectant and quiet heartbreak. But today was different. Today was targeted. She did this on purpose, Laura murmured. The spit, the timing, the fines, all of it. She did, I said, and she's going to wish she hadn't. We stayed there for a long moment, letting the breeze move around us, letting the neighborhood remain unaware of the shift happening right here on our front steps. When she finally sat up, I saw something new settle behind her eyes. Not fear anymore. Resolve. Tell me what you found, she said. So I did. I told her about the trench, the redirected runoff, the compacted soil, the warped stones, the unpermitted changes, everything the HOA had no right to alter, everything that could threaten the playground, the creek, the safety of the community. Her eyebrows pulled together, the concern sharp but focused. That's dangerous. It is, I said, and intentional. She inhaled slowly, the kind of breath someone takes when they know the picture is bigger, much bigger than it first appeared. So what happens now? What happened now wasn't anger. It wasn't confrontation. It wasn't another complaint filed into a void where Marjorie held the reins. It was documentation. It was evidence. It was quiet, inevitable escalation. We go inside, I said, and I start drafting the full report. Photos, timestamps, soil displacement, grading inconsistencies, everything. She nodded, but her gaze drifted toward the street, toward the neighbors' windows cracked just slightly open, toward the blinds shifting as people peeked outside, toward the silent acknowledgement that everyone had seen her humiliation and no one had stepped in. Not because they didn't care, because they were afraid. Her expression softened in a sad, tired way that stabbed at me. People watched, she murmured, but they didn't say anything. They will, I told her. Once they realize they're not alone. She gave a small, skeptical laugh. You really think so? I know so, I said, and I did, because cracks didn't appear alone. They spread when pressure built, when accountability loomed, when the first witness, even one trembling like Daniel, began shifting from silence to truth. I helped her stand, and we walked inside together. The moment the door shut behind us, I felt the house breathe around us, safe for now, but expectant, waiting. I set my phone on the dining table, pulled out the laptop, and opened a fresh document. The cursor blinked against the blank page, steady and patient, like it already knew what was coming. Laura hovered for a moment, then rested her hand gently on the back of my chair. Document everything, she said, every second of today. I will, I replied, and I did. I typed out the timeline, the confrontation, the spit, the backdated violations, the trench, the soil, the altered drainage path. I inserted photos, labeled each one with location and conditions. I marked the time I discovered the grading violation. With each detail added, something inside me tightened into purpose. This wasn't a complaint. This was a record that wouldn't disappear just because the board wanted it to. A record that would anchor the exposure to come. By the time I finished the initial outline, the sky outside had deepened into late afternoon gold. The shadows stretched long across the floor, touching the baby book stacked on the coffee table, the ultrasound photo clipped to the fridge, the small knitted hat resting on the counter, all reminders of what we were fighting for. I closed the laptop gently. I'm filing this, I said. Not with the HOA, with the city. Laura nodded once, a single steady movement. The shift had begun. I submitted the report to the city with a single click, watching the confirmation message flash across the screen before fading into the clean white of the inbox. The air in the room felt different afterward, lighter in one way, heavier in another. The kind of weight that said a line had officially been crossed, and there was no walking it back. Laura rested a hand on my shoulder, her touch warm and steady. You did the right thing, she said. Maybe. But the right thing has a way of drawing shadows out of hiding. A knock hit our front door, sharp, fast, almost startled. Laura tensed immediately. I stood, moving toward the entryway. Through the glass panel, I saw a familiar figure shifting from foot to foot on the porch. Daniel, but not the version of him I'd seen earlier. His shoulders were hunched deeper. His baseball cap sat twisted in his hands. His eyes kept flicking over his shoulder, scanning the street as if he expected someone to appear out of thin air and drag him away for standing here. I opened the door. I need to talk, he blurted, voice low and frayed. Not out here, please. I stepped aside, motioning him in. He hesitated for only a second before crossing the threshold, like someone entering a confession booth. He wasn't here to deny anything. That was obvious the moment he walked into our living room. His hands shook as he ran them over his face, and every breath came too fast for the slow, quiet house around us. You okay? I asked gently. No, he said. No, I'm not. He sat heavily on the edge of the armchair, elbows on his knees, gaze pinned to the floor. For a moment, he looked like a man carrying a 100-pound weight no one else could see. And then I noticed something poking out of his jacket pocket, a worn dog collar. The leather was cracked, the tag dulled with age. He caught me noticing and swallowed hard. It was my brother's, he said quietly. His service dog, Max. His thumb brushed the tag like it was something fragile. My brother had epilepsy. Max was trained to warn him when the seizures were coming, kept him safe for years. He paused. His eyes glistened, but he blinked it back quickly, jaw tightening. When my brother died, Max wouldn't leave his side. His voice wavered, soft as frayed twine. We buried Max with him, but I kept the collar. I sat across from him, letting silence fill the room until he continued. He died because of a fall, Daniel said. Slipped on wet ground. He hit his head on a retaining wall. A drainage issue caused the runoff. They said it was unpredictable, an accident. His face twitched. It wasn't. That collar suddenly felt like the heaviest object in the world. He looked up at me for the first time. When I saw you out there this morning, when I saw your wife, I couldn't do it again. I can't stay quiet and watch someone else get hurt because of the same mistakes. I leaned forward slightly. The trench behind the playground, you knew about it. He nodded, a jerky movement filled with guilt. She told me to dig it, said it was temporary, said the board approved it verbally and paperwork would follow. He pressed a hand against his forehead. There was no paperwork, ever. She wanted to protect the landscaping around the new homes. Keep her. Project looking pristine. And she redirected runoff toward the playground, I said. His breath hitched. I told her it wasn't safe. I told her. She said my job was to follow instructions. His voice cracked on the last word. Laura stepped closer, her hand clasped over her stomach again, instinctive, protective. Daniel's gaze drifted to her belly, and everything inside him seemed to crumble. That tree, what she did to your wife. He shook his head fiercely. I can't be the reason a kid gets hurt. I won't. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a folded stack of papers. They weren't official forms. They were work logs, his work logs, notes, dates, materials, locations, the kind of documentation he wasn't supposed to keep. She made me sign a non-disclosure, he whispered, said it was to protect the HOA from liability. But I kept my own records anyway. I don't care what happens to me now. You need to see this. I unfolded the papers carefully. Every entry lined up with the trench. Every order traced back to her. Every adjustment showed intent. Not maintenance, not repair, but alteration. He looked like someone finally cutting the weight off his chest after years of carrying it. This is more than a violation, I said quietly. It's a danger, Daniel finished. And now it's yours to expose, because she'll bury me if she finds out I came here. Laura placed a hand on his arm, her voice soft. You're doing the right thing. He closed his eyes, exhaling a tremor that looked like relief and despair tangled together. Just make it mean something, he said. It will, I promised, because this wasn't just evidence now. This was a story, one with witnesses, one with a past, one with a cost too high to ignore. And once the public saw it, once the truth left this living room, nothing in Copper Ridge would stay buried again. Daniel's last words were still, hanging in the air when the front door clicked shut behind him. The house felt heavier after he left, as though his confession had settled into the walls, into the shadows, into the space between every breath Laura and I took. She sat quietly on the edge of the sofa, her fingers tracing the worn fabric, her eyes distant in a way that told me she wasn't thinking about the tree anymore. She was thinking about the collar, about Max, about the brother Daniel lost because someone ignored the same kind of warnings I had found behind the playground. He looked broken, she said finally. He was holding that weight alone, I replied, for a long time. And now he's trusting us with it, I nodded. And we're not letting that trust die. A quiet determination settled over her face. So, what do we do next? We take this to someone who can force it into the light, I said. Someone the HOA can't silence. An attorney. She didn't say it like a question. She said it like a step already taken. 10 minutes later, I was sliding into the driver's seat while she buckled herself carefully beside me. I didn't like her coming. Part of me wanted her wrapped in blankets on the couch, far from the stress of this morning. But she insisted. She said if this fight was hers too, she wasn't sitting on the sidelines. The drive to the downtown district of Ridgeview was quiet, broken only by the low hum of the engine and the occasional turn signal click. The attorney's office sat on the top floor of a modest 5-story building, with glass windows that reflected the scattered sunlight. Inside, The lobby was all soft carpet and calming art prints, the kind of place designed to make conflict feel civilized. A receptionist greeted us, then guided us into a conference room with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the foothills. The room smelled faintly of coffee and leather. Old cases, old battles, old truths. When the door opened again, Attorney Melissa Klein stepped inside. She was direct, composed, the type of person who looked at a problem and immediately started mapping its weak points. She shook my hand firmly and offered Laura a soft, reassuring nod before taking her seat. "Tell me everything," she said. So I did, not hurried, not dramatic, just the truth, the spit, the humiliation, the backdated fines, the forged timestamps, the tree's significance, the rerouted drainage, the unpermitted trench, the warped stones, the danger to the playground, and finally Daniel's confession, the logs, the non-disclosure, the orders traced directly back to Marjorie. Melissa didn't interrupt. She took notes quickly, efficiently, but I watched the shift in her expression when I placed Daniel's records on the table. Her pen paused for half a heartbeat, recognition, calculation, before she continued writing. When I finished, the room held a strange stillness. Melissa leaned back, tapping her pen gently against her notepad. "This isn't a simple misconduct case," she said. "This is systemic abuse of authority, and it's not going to stay contained inside your HOA once we push it into the open." She exhaled through her nose. "Especially not with the emotional component attached to your wife's experience." Laura lowered her gaze, her hand drifting instinctively to her belly. Melissa noticed. "You were targeted because she believed you wouldn't fight back," she said. "HOA bullies rely on fear. They expect silence." "Well," I said, "she miscalculated." Melissa nodded. "And you did the right thing filing with the city. It creates a paper trail she can't erase." She tapped the pages again. "But this, Daniel's logs, this is something different. This is intent. This is liability. This is what will interest the media." That word landed with a soft but certain weight. Media. Laura stiffened slightly. "Do we need the media?" "You don't need them," Melissa said. "But the truth does. Exposure forces institutions to act faster. It applies pressure where formal complaints move slowly." Pressure. Exactly what Marjorie never expected to face. Melissa began outlining next steps, how she would organize the evidence, what documentation to prepare next, who to contact at the city to follow up, how to ensure Daniel's identity remained shielded until absolutely necessary. Her voice was calm, clinical, professional, but beneath the surface I heard something else. Conviction. She believed in this fight. She believed we could win it, and she believed exposure would be the turning point. As she spoke, I realized something important. This wasn't just about our tree anymore. It wasn't just about the spit or the slur or the fines. It wasn't even just about the trench behind the playground. This was about a woman who had been allowed to rule unchecked, about a community manipulated through fear, about the quiet ways authority corrodes when no one challenges its boundaries. And now, finally, the challenge was beginning. When we stood to leave, Melissa gave me a final instruction. Document everything. From this moment forward, nothing is too small. I nodded. "I already started." She smiled, a small, knowing smile. "Good," she said, "because stories like this rarely stay small once the truth comes out." Back in the car, Laura rested her hand on mine. "It's happening," she whispered. "We're actually doing this." I squeezed her hand gently. "We're not doing this," I said. "It's already started." And as the sunlight shifted across the dashboard, I understood the truth of it fully. Authority wasn't collapsing tomorrow. It was collapsing now. We drove home in a silence that didn't feel empty. It felt charged, like static gathering before a storm. Laura kept her hand on mine the entire drive, her thumb brushing slow circles across my skin. I didn't need to look at her to know she felt the same shift I did. Something irreversible had begun. By the time we pulled into the driveway, the sun had dipped low enough to cast long shadows from the houses, stretching across the pavement like fingers reaching toward our car. "I need to organize everything before tonight," I said. She nodded. "I'll make tea. You get what you need." But I didn't go inside, not yet. There was one place I needed to be before I sat down at the desk again. The community green pavilion, the open-air wooden structure near the center of Copper Ridge, where residents sometimes gathered for summer barbecues or yoga classes. Today it was empty, its benches chilled by the wind, its roof casting a wide, quiet shade over the green lawn. The pavilion felt neutral, public, uncontrolled, perfect for what came next. I walked across the grass, the blades brushing my shoes with a soft hiss. When I stepped beneath the pavilion roof, the whole neighborhood spread out in front of me. Rooftops, the looping trail, the distant creek, and the faint silhouette of the playground hill. Everything was still, too still, as if Copper Ridge itself was holding its breath. I placed my laptop bag on the table, pulled out the folders from Melissa's office, and began organizing. Photos, logs, diagrams, screenshots, copies of the 4 violation notices, including the ones she backdated. I arranged them in a grid, aligning corners, flattening edges, creating order out of spite. I heard footsteps before I saw him, soft ones, hesitant. I didn't look up until the steps reached the edge of the pavilion. It wasn't Daniel, it was a neighbor, Mr. Lanning, the elderly man who walked his dog past us earlier. Today he was alone, his hands tucked into the pockets of a faded jacket, the wind ruffling the thin gray hair above his forehead. He stayed on the edge of the pavilion, half sheltered, half exposed. "You're making a case," he said quietly. I didn't answer immediately. I simply nodded. "I am." He stepped a little closer, but not enough to invade my space. He looked at the papers spread across the table, his gaze lingering on the violation notices. "She targeted your wife," he said. Everyone saw. His voice wasn't angry. It wasn't emotional. It was tired, the fatigue of someone who'd spent too long adjusting himself around someone else's power. "I've seen her do it before," he added. "Not like today, but close." I studied him a little more carefully then. His shoulders carried something heavy, something long-standing, the kind of weight you didn't gain from a single bad day. "Why didn't anyone say anything?" I asked, not accusing, just asking. He laughed once, low, humorless. "Because she punishes people who speak. You file a complaint, she files 3 on you. You vote against her, she finds a violation on your gutter slope or your mailbox height." He shook his head. "Fear keeps a neighborhood quiet." I nodded again, slower this time. "Not anymore." He hesitated before moving closer, reaching into his jacket and pulling out a small, worn envelope. "She fined me for having a mobility ramp installed," he said. "Said it wasn't approved. I built it after my stroke." I felt something hot rise in my throat. Not anger exactly, but something sharper, something more focused. "She told me," he continued, "that if I wanted to keep using it, I'd have to pay for a special variance she would bring to vote. It never came to vote." He placed the envelope on the table. Inside were photos of the ramp and a copy of the fine. Documents years older than anything currently swirling around my house, but damning in a different way. Evidence of a pattern, evidence of a culture, evidence that the abuse extended far beyond me and Laura. He cleared his throat. "I'm not asking for anything. I'm just tired of seeing people get hit because they're easy targets." He turned to leave, but paused. "Whatever you're doing, keep doing it." He walked away slowly, his steps uneven but determined. When he reached the sidewalk, he didn't look back. I sat there for a long moment, staring at the new envelope. Another fracture, another witness, another piece of truth ready to tear through the silence that held this place together. Then I opened my laptop, and I began. I built the timeline first, the confrontation, the fines, the retaliation, the trench. Then I linked every piece of evidence to its place on the map. I added Daniel's logs, Mr. Lanning's fine, the screenshots, the photos, the soil analysis. With every line typed, every file attached, the case grew. Not just a complaint, a foundation. Not just a story, a record. Not just a record, a weapon. And when the media saw it, when the city reviewed it, when the insurer realized what they'd been exposed to, it wouldn't be my voice alone anymore. It would be the voice of a neighborhood waking up. I closed the computer gently, feeling the wind sweep through the pavilion and scatter a few loose blades of grass across the bench. The collapse had already begun. I left the pavilion as the first chill of evening slipped across the green. The air carried a thin edge, the kind that warned night was coming soon, but my mind wasn't on the temperature. It was on the weight of the evidence packed in my bag. A living thing now, built from truth and fear and defiance. The laptop felt heavier than it should have as I walked back toward the house, the wind brushing against my jacket and stirring the grass behind me. Laura stood at the window when I returned, her silhouette framed by the glow of the living room lamp. The moment I stepped inside, she met me halfway across the entryway, her hand instinctively resting on her belly again. "You're back," she said softly. "I got everything. Organized," I replied. "And something else, someone else." Her eyebrows lifted. "Who?" "Lanning, the man with the dog this morning. He gave me proof she targeted him years ago, over a mobility ramp." Laura's face tightened. "She fined him for that?" "Extorted him," I said. "Or tried to." She shook her head slowly, like the truth was heavier than she anticipated. "This isn't just abuse of authority. This is a pattern." "It is," I said. "And patterns leave trails, trails that fall apart under pressure." She took a breath, her shoulders rising, then settling. "So what now?" Now was the part most people never saw. The part where pressure stopped being theoretical and started moving quietly, inevitably, toward the people who tried to hide from it. "I follow up with the city," I said. "And then I wait." But the waiting didn't last long. An email notification chimed from my phone, the tone quick, sharp, distinct from anything else. I pulled it from my pocket and opened the message. It was from the city's Environmental Compliance Department, the same office I'd worked with during regional audits. The subject line was simple: RE, report received, additional information. Requested. My pulse tapped once, steady and certain. They weren't ignoring it. They weren't shelving it. They were acting. "They want photos, timestamps, and any historical evidence," I told Laura, "and they want it today." "Give them everything," she said. "I will." But there was something else I needed to do first, something Melissa had told me during our meeting. She'd said media pressure would only work if the story had human impact, real faces, real consequences. I took a breath. "I'm going to the news station." Laura blinked. "Tonight?" "Yes." I ran my hand through my hair, feeling the tension gather beneath my scalp. "They need the human side of this. What happened to you? The significance of the tree. The humiliation she thought she could bury." She looked down at her stomach, her hand tracing a slow circle. "I don't want to be public," she whispered, "but I want her to be held accountable." "You won't be alone when the story airs," I said. "Not for a second." Her gaze lifted to mine, and I saw the moment she realized something was shifting inside both of us. Not fear anymore, but purpose. I grabbed the laptop bag again and kissed her forehead. "I'll call you as soon as I'm done." The newsroom sat on the far edge of Ridgeview, a low brick building with fluorescent lights glowing through fog glass panels. Inside, the hum of printers, keyboards, and rushing staff filled the air with a faint sense of urgency. I checked in with the receptionist, who pointed me toward a side office with a half-open door. Inside sat reporter Jenna Alvarez, mid-30s, sharp-eyed, hair tied back, papers scattered across her desk like the aftermath of a storm. She looked up when I entered. "You must be Evan," she said. "I got the tip from an anonymous source." My throat tightened for a moment. The anonymous source could only be one person: Daniel. I sat, unzipped the laptop bag, and placed everything on the desk. The photos, the logs, the printed copies of the finds, the soil images, the trench analysis, Lanning's envelope, the time stamps. Jenna flipped through each item slowly, her eyes narrowing in concentration. "You understand," she said after a moment. "When this airs, there's no going back. This becomes public record. It forces the HOA, the city, and the insurer into motion." "I understand," I said. "And your wife?" she asked gently. "She understands too." Jenna nodded once. "Good, because this isn't just a story about a tree or a violation. This is a story about unchecked authority." "Exactly," I said. She tapped her pen against one of the photos, the spit stain on the concrete, captured before it dried. "This alone is enough for viewers to react, but combined with everything else," she exhaled, "this is going to get attention." She stood and motioned toward the recording room. "Let's get your statement." My heart thudded once, not nervous, but certain. I followed her inside, sat under the lights, and spoke clearly, calmly, intentionally about what happened, about what I saw, about what she did to my wife, about the abuse that spread quietly through the neighborhood like roots beneath soil. When it was done, Jenna shook my hand. "This will air tomorrow evening," she said, "and the moment it does, everything changes." Driving home, the neighborhood looked different. The streetlights flickered against the pavement. Shadows clung to the fences. Windows glowed faintly as families settled in for the night. But the silence wasn't the same. It wasn't fear anymore. It was the moment before a wave hits shore, and I knew when it hit, it would take down everything standing in its way. The next evening arrived with the charged heaviness of a storm that hadn't yet broken. I didn't need to check the clock to know the broadcast had aired. The shift in the neighborhood told me before my phone even buzzed. Curtains twitched, porch lights flicked on earlier than usual. Cars that normally passed without slowing were now crawling, their drivers stealing glances toward our lot. When a neighbor walking his dog gave me a firm nod instead of the usual quick glance away, I knew the story had landed exactly where it needed to. But the real moment, the one everything had been building toward, waited for me on the far edge of Copper Ridge in the community hall, a glass and wood building usually reserved for potlucks and budget meetings. Tonight, its windows glowed bright enough to spill light onto the sidewalk, and the parking lot was full. I tightened my grip on the evidence bag, feeling the edges of the documents. Inside, Laura walked beside me, her hand resting on her belly in that protective gesture she couldn't seem to fight anymore. As we approached the double doors, she whispered, "Whatever happens in there, I'm proud of you." "I'm proud of us," I said. Inside, the air buzzed with tension. Residents filled every seat. Others lined the walls. A few stood near the back, murmuring in low voices. Cameras were set up along the left wall. Local media crews. Lights angled toward the board's long, elevated table at the front of the room. Marjorie was already seated in the center, her clipboard resting neatly before her, her expression carved into a hard, humorless mask. But she wasn't as calm as she pretended. The stiffness in her shoulders, the tightness in her jaw, I recognized that kind of rigidity. It was the posture of someone holding on by her fingertips. Her gaze cut toward me when we entered, sharp and venomous. But there was something else beneath it now. Fear. The board president cleared his throat and tapped the microphone. "We will now begin the emergency session called in response to the events reported in yesterday's broadcast." A ripple moved through the crowd, a low murmur of anticipation. The president continued, "The meeting will address allegations of misconduct, retaliation, and potential safety hazards resulting from unauthorized modifications to community infrastructure." Marjorie's lips pinched white. A woman sitting near the wall spoke loudly enough for the room to hush. "Start with what she did to that man's wife." Every eye swung toward Laura. She held her ground. I watched the strength in her spine, the calm in her breathing, the quiet certainty that radiated from her, even though she'd been targeted so brutally. The president gestured. "Mr. Holt, please step forward." I walked up the center aisle, the weight of every resident's eyes on me, some supportive, some curious, some afraid to be seen, supporting anything at all. But the silence that fell when I reached the microphone was total. "I'm here," I said, "because something dangerous happened in this community, and something worse followed." I placed the evidence bag on the podium and unzipped it. "This," I continued, lifting the photo of the trench behind the playground, "is an unpermitted alteration to a drainage easement. It redirects runoff toward a hill used by children daily. It violates city code and creates erosion risks that could cause structural collapse." A wave of gasps moved through the hall. I lifted Daniel's logs next. "These are records kept by the HOA's landscaping contractor, documenting every instruction he was given, every unauthorized change he was ordered to make, and every warning he tried to give." Daniel stood near the back, half hidden behind a group of neighbors, his hands clasped tightly in front of him. When our eyes met, he looked like he might break, not from fear, but from relief. "And this," I said, holding up the photos of the spit incident, "is how your vice president responded when my wife asked why our perfectly compliant tree had been targeted. This is abuse of authority. This is retaliation." There was no murmuring now, just outrage. One woman stood abruptly. "She fined my husband for painting the mailbox 2 shades too light." A man near the aisle added, She threatened to tow my truck because a tire touched the grass. Another voice trembled out. She told me my disability ramp needed board approval. The room caught fire with confession. One after another, residents stepped forward, each story dropping like stones into a well already too full. Marjorie slammed her palm on the table. "Enough! These are lies." "No," the president said sharply. "They're not." He turned toward her. "We received a notice from the city this morning. They've opened a formal investigation." Her face drained of color. "And your insurer," he added, "has notified us that due to the broadcast, the allegations fall under mandatory review." The camera zoomed closer. Neighbors leaned forward. The entire hall held its breath. "You are hereby suspended," the president announced, "pending the outcome of the investigation." A roar of shock and vindication rippled through the crowd. Marjorie stood abruptly, her chair scraping hard against the floor. "You can't do this!" But she wasn't the authority anymore. The room, the very community she'd controlled, had turned. The president gave her a cold, steady look. "This meeting is adjourned." I stepped away from the podium as the hall erupted in voices, relief, anger, gratitude, all swirling into a wave that had been waiting years to rise. Laura slipped her hand into mine, her fingers warm and steady. "It's happening," she whispered, and for the first time, the collapse of her authority felt complete. The Baum Community Hall was still humming when we stepped outside, voices echoing behind the closing doors like the tail end of a storm rolling off into the distance. The night air was cool, sharp, almost cleansing. Porch lights across Copper Ridge flicked on one by one, as if the whole neighborhood had been holding its breath until the suspension was announced. Now, for the first time in a long while, it felt like the place could exhale. Laura squeezed my hand, leaning into me with a tired but relieved smile. "It's over," she whispered. "Almost," I said. "But the worst part, yes, it's over." Residents spilled out of the hall in small clusters, not rushing, not hiding, but walking with a new kind of ease, shoulders relaxed, voices rising without fear of being overheard, steps lighter than they'd been that morning. It struck me how quickly a community could change when fear no longer dictated its rhythm. I guided Laura toward the overlook above the creek, one of the quietest spots in Copper Ridge, where a wooden railing stretched across a gentle drop to the winding water below. We'd walked here before, long before the tree, long before the morning confrontation. Tonight, it felt like the right place to stand and let the final pieces of the day settle. The creek murmured softly beneath us, reflecting the moon and broken fragments across its surface. A calm place. A place untouched by any rulebook or clipboard, the opposite of everything we'd fought against. "You did this," Laura said, her voice warm despite the exhaustion threading through it. "We did," I corrected, brushing my thumb along her knuckles. "You didn't back down, even when she tried to humiliate you." Her eyes softened. "You didn't either." We stood in quiet for a moment, soaking in the peace of the overlook. Down below, the trees swayed gently, their leaves whispering through the air like they already knew the neighborhood had shifted. I thought of Daniel, the fear in his stance, the guilt in his voice, the worn collar he'd kept all those years. I thought of Mr. Lanning and the envelope he'd handed over with trembling fingers. I thought of the neighbors who finally spoke up in that hall after years of silence. I thought of the children who played on the hill, never knowing how close danger had been. Everything connected now. Every voice, every witness, every fracture. Authority had been unchecked for too long, and it broke under pressure exactly the way it always does when someone refuses to look away. "You think she'll try to fight back?" Laura asked. "Not this time," I said. "The city's involved, the insurer, the news. She's out of places to hide. And the board? They're already shifting. Didn't you see it? Some of them looked relieved when she was suspended." She let out a long breath. "I guess fear works both ways." "It does," I said. "And sometimes it just takes one person stepping forward to show everyone else the way out." We stood for a while, letting the creek wash the last of the tension away. Eventually we turned back toward the house, walking slowly along the trail. When we passed the rainbow sapling, its leaves shimmered under the streetlight, casting faint shadows that danced around its base. It looked stronger than it had this morning, somehow steadier. "It's safe now," Laura whispered. "It is," I said, and it's staying right where it is. The symbolism wasn't lost on either of us. The tree had survived the worst of her retaliation. It had become the center of the story, not for its leaves or its colors, but for what it represented. A future we fought for, a hope she tried to crush, a promise that refused to bend. As we reached our front door, our neighbor to the left stepped outside with his young daughter. He lifted a hand tentatively, uncertain at first. "Good job in there," he said. About time, someone stood up to her. Others followed, quiet acknowledgments, nods, small words of gratitude that floated across driveways like fireflies. Not loud, not showy, but meaningful in a way that made the finality of the night sink in fully. Laura squeezed my hand. "You changed this place," she said. "We changed it," I repeated. The night felt still then, calm in a way it hadn't been since the sapling first went into the soil. I opened the door for her, stepping inside with a sense of completion I hadn't felt in a long time. Justice didn't erase what happened. It didn't replace the spit, the slur, the fear. But it brought accountability. It brought truth. It brought a community back to itself. And that was enough. Before we turned in for the night, I stepped back outside for one last look at the street. Quiet, peaceful, no clipboard shadows lurking in the dark. A neighborhood free from her grip, a story closed. If you want more stories of homeowners standing up to HOA tyranny, hit subscribe right now, share your story in the comments, and let me know where you're watching from.